Um, Thanks, Moira. Thank you very much to the entire team to bring me over here, having a wonderful day yesterday and a wonderful dinner. And I have to say, having the sun impacting the screens at a presentation was not my first concern about coming to Glasgow. But nonetheless, I think between 4 screens at any one moment, you'll be able to see some of the slides that are there. I tend to move around, so the poor cameraman at the back is going to get a really good workout this morning. So we're here to talk about space. And in order to talk about space, what I want to do is just give you a little mini 2-minute background about McGill, because there are some really interesting connections between McGill and Glasgow, and I don't know if you know that, but I thought I'd let you know. This is James McGill, is the founder of McGill University, and actually attended and graduated from the University of Glasgow, lived in Glasgow, went over to Canada in the mid-1700s, became a very, very wealthy man, the most wealthy in Montreal, and in his death bequeathed 10,000 pounds to create the Royal Institute for the Advancement of Learning, which is basically the founding corporate entity, even still today, that is McGill University. And that was one of the first universities almost the first university in Canada, and then from there spawned all sorts of other universities from there. We have a wonderful picture of him on our campus there. And actually, this particular picture, if you can see that, is actually at Stockard Street, and there's a plaque here in Glasgow to James McGill, the founder of McGill University. So we have a very nice interconnection between our two universities, and I thought I'd mention that as a good place to start. So those of you that don't know McGill University in Montreal, generally this is our iconic view of our arts building, you know, that at least some of the architecture resembles yours. We're not as old, 1821 is the founding date of the university itself, but you probably, although see this, this is probably a little bit more accurate as to what McGill looks like even now. Our snow is just melting now, so it's getting to be a little bit nice. But to give you a little bit of background about McGill itself, we have about 35,000 undergraduate students, about 8,000 graduate students or so, bringing us to around the low 40s. We have about 1,700 tenure-track faculty and a number of staff, 3,400 men in staff, and about 475 classrooms, which works out to about 21,000 seats all over the place. We're an urban campus, downtown Montreal. We happen to be right on the side of the mountain. We have some green space, but space is a real issue for us. We're not building new buildings very, very rarely, and if we are, they're not always teaching buildings. And many of our buildings are patrimonial buildings, not quite the grandeur of Butte Hall here, but we definitely have a lot of buildings where things like asbestos and things like ventilation and all those other wonderful things makes it very difficult for us to create fantastic, fabulous learning spaces. So this 190-year-old heritage campus has a very large accumulated deferred maintenance. This means these are the things you forgot to take care of, or should have taken care of, but didn't. So our infrastructure, that becomes an aging issue. But despite that, we've done a lot of things over the last 10 years to rethink and revamp our learning spaces on campus, and that's some of the things that I want to talk to you about today. So the story arc that I want to lead us through this morning is talk about what we know about learning, because that has a direct impact in terms of thinking about active learning as to what kinds of spaces we want to build and what kinds of teaching and learning we want to support. And second, think about, well, what's so important about space? Is it really just comfy chairs and nice colors, or is there something more to that? And lastly, spend a lot of time exploring, well, what are some examples? What are wonderful pictures of other spaces all across the world that support the kind of philosophy of active learning anywhere? Meaning that you can do active learning in any space. It just depends on what the space is designed to do to support your teaching and learning. So in order to really start, and I think one of the most important things about working in academia and thinking about the worldview that we have is we need to focus on evidence. We need to make all of our decisions based on data and looking at what's out there and what is the research telling us when we start to make decisions around policy, decisions around space, decisions around learning, and decisions around instruction that we have every day. And there's a great deal of evidence in all sorts of different areas. So I thought the place that we start is, well, what do we know about learning? You know, there's been years and years of research on learning. We tend to ignore it most of the time, but there is a lot of research evidence that really does point us in certain directions and helps us avoid others. So to start, what I wanted to do is how would you complete this sentence? I learn best when... Sorry? When you do it. What else? When you have coffee. What else? I learn best when you have time. That's right. Time, coffee, interactive. What else? Motivated. We have a quiet space. Engaged, interested. Nobody said I learned best when I'm lectured at, but that's okay. We'll continue on that venue. But I think you've already brought out, and what's nice about that is that you pretty much summarize most of the educational literature right there, and we can move on. But I think I want to touch on a few things that are really important. And if we sort of summarize everything we know about teaching and learning in one slide, here it is. So we have the idea that learners create knowledge actively and uniquely, so that you are basically creating and actively making connections inside your brain at all times, and constructing you're constructing or reconstructing your surrounding with inside a model inside your own head. And what that basically means is that we know that learners learn best when first they experience course content in multiple modalities. What that means is basically that just hearing it isn't enough. Seeing it alone isn't enough. Experiencing it isn't enough. You need as many modalities as you possibly can. The more modalities you add, the better off the learning is. Now, it's very, very important to divorce that from the idea of preference. And I want to make that very clear. There isn't any evidence that learning styles exist. And not only that, but there's also no evidence that matching a learning style to preferred teaching style has any impact on learning whatsoever. But what is very clear is the more opportunities you have for people to learn in different ways, the more likely it is for learning to happen. You hear something, you see something, you do something all at once, all of that packages together. And that's really important because we have to think about that in terms of a universal design approach to learning when we're talking with our own students. So just talking at the students isn't enough. Just showing a visual isn't enough. You need to have a whole package and a whole range of experiences in order for them to take the course content and be able to do something with that. The second is we need to connect new knowledge to existing knowledge. We know that's how we build our information. We know we take what we have as our worldview and we layer things on top of it. So one of the most difficult things is if that fundamental core that we're layering on top of has some serious flaws, we need to unpack and repack. And I think that's a really good way of thinking about things, is that your job that you're doing into your classrooms is you're building blocks. You're setting building blocks out and building a staircase that you're helping students climb. And the metaphor is very, very clear. You're building the staircase to help students climb. You're not pushing them up the stairs. They have to take the responsibility to take the step up. The third is we need to focus attention on the learning experience. This goes to the myth of the multitasker. How many students have ever told you that they multitask? Anybody say that? Or your kids, even worse. My kids, oh, we multitask. We're doing all these things. Nobody can multitask. There's absolutely no brain-based evidence that multitasking even exists in any way, shape, or form. We switch tasks, and we can switch tasks quickly from one thing to another. But if you're texting and walking, and there happens to be a fountain in front of you, guess what's going to happen? As we saw in some of the other keynotes, you're going to fall straight into it. You're focusing on a particular experience. The human mind is designed, and our human experience is designed to focus in on things. If we didn't focus in on things, we'd never be able to do anything. And that's really important because the idea that if a student is, well, I'm actually surfing the web and watching Netflix while I'm writing my paper, well, actually that means you're not writing your paper. Or that means you're not focusing on our discussion. Or maybe it's time to put the laptop down and actually talk with each other. Maybe checking your email while you're at the staff meeting means you're probably not engaged at the staff meeting. They need to stay motivated. Students have to be engaged. Engagement is the precursor to everything that we're doing in learning. Motivation can be positive or negative. Generally, we want things positive, and generally, we want the motivation internal rather than external. But in general, any kind of motivation that we want to have is important in order to push students forward in one way or the other. And of course, one of our most important connections in teaching and learning is feedback. The closer the feedback is to the event, the more likely somebody is to learn it. So the idea is that there's a reason why the students are in your office after the first midterm crying on your doorstep. Why? Because it's probably the first moment that they actually got feedback about what they were learning. And they realized, I did everything wrong, or I studied the wrong things, or I'm focusing in the wrong directions. We need to think in our own heads, how can we give students feedback early and often, as much as possible? Smaller bite-sized chunks, rather than the 100% final exam, which at that point the course is over and there's no real feedback at all. How can we focus on smaller sort of weekly quizzes, weekly feedback? It doesn't have to be graded. You can remove all that ideas out, but we really do need to make sure we're able to have opportunities for students to get that feedback early and often. And the last is, of course, working on engaging, collaborative, and authentic experiences. The more authentic the experience is, the more connected to real life, the easier it is for students to see the relevance, and the easier it is for students to connect to those ideas. And one of the other things that goes with that engaging, collaborative is the idea of active learning. So the next question is, well, what is active learning? How would we define active learning? I mean, we could sort of learning while we're doing jumping jacks. I guess is one form of active learning. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. But when you look at some of the interesting definitions, and this one comes from Barkley, who talked about a really important definition in active learning, is there are two key parts, or a couple of key parts. The first is that the mind is actively engaged. It doesn't necessarily mean you're doing jumping jacks, but it does mean that the mind is engaged in what you're doing. And the second thing is that students are dynamic participants in the learning. You cannot have active learning if the students don't engage. Students have a responsibility in this process. It is not all up to the instructor or all up to the student. The students have to be able to partake in and come to the table in an active way. And of course, the last parts here are reflecting and monitoring the process and the results. So you have to be doing things and then thinking about how you are doing things and why you are doing things and what you're doing to improve them. So there's a lot of meta-level things going on in that sentence all at once. So, okay, you know what? There's been lecturing going on for centuries. Most of our universities are built on the idea of the iconic lecture. Most people have graduated from universities, done perfectly fine. So what? Why do we even need active learning? I mean, we've been doing things fine in a lecture style for many years. Where's the evidence that this has any sort of impact? And there's actually some really key, interesting evidence to look at. And I'm going to show you 4 specific studies that really talk about this in a very large way that demonstrate some of that evidence. The first one is a study in physics coming out of Indiana by Richard Hackey in 1998, I think it's 96. And what he did is he looked at thousands and thousands of students. And one of the nice things about physics, anybody teaching physics here? Okay, some physics teachers. One of the nice things about physics is if you have something called the force concept inventory. And the marvelous thing about the force concept inventory is it allows you to test knowledge of physics without knowing anything about physics. So it's particularly interesting because what you can do is you can give people the force concept inventory at the very beginning of their university career, and then you could do a whole bunch of things to them, and then you can give it to them again, and you can actually look at improvements. Now, not all domains have this wonderful tool, but physicists do. And that's actually why if you look at a lot of the research in education, a lot of it's coming from physics, because they have a tool like this that they can look at. And it asks things like, well, what happens when you drop a ball? Describe if I spin a ball, let's say in a circle, and I let go, which direction is it going to go? These sort of ideas that are core concepts in physics that can be described using regular language or by described using materials and formulas. So what he found out was that students engaged in courses with interactive engagement had a gain of 2 standard deviations higher than traditional courses. 2 standard deviations higher. Okay? And when you start looking at the data across the biggest gains, if you look at the middle there around both in college and high school, the significant active learning components, the more there were, the more the gain. In other words, just being told information about physics was not enough. Well, it might have been enough for just the bare minimum. But in order to get to that next level, the students were able to do much better by moving towards a much more interactive, engaged opportunities. Other evidence, that's a good example, Michael Prince, those of you in engineering, this is a seminal article that talks about all of the evidence that has been looked at in terms of active learning in engineering and elsewhere. It goes through all different areas like problem-based learning and what they say about collaborative learning and all the buzzwords that you'd hear. And what's really interesting is that, in all of the studies, there's support for and evidence of examples that active learning in all situations has led to improved students' attitudes, improved student performance, improved students' experiences across the domains. Enormous wealth of research and evidence. This one's from pharmacology. This is Joel Michael. And what's really interesting, what Michael does when he looks through this article and looks through the evidence that's out there, he said, if this was in the domain of medicine, if we were researching active learning and we were in medicine, we would have stopped doing this research about 15 years ago. The evidence is so obvious that what we've been doing is just keep doing it over and over and over and over. The evidence is clear. It's been there for years. We just have to read it. And the last one, which is probably one of the biggest, this was in 2004, and this is a huge meta-analysis of active learning across science, engineering, and math. You notice a lot of the evidence I'm showing you is in STEM, but there are lots of other examples in other disciplines I'll show you in a second. But this one's really interesting is that this looked at across the board with hundreds of studies that those that had active learning, significant active learning components had a huge lower failure rate, especially in students from minority backgrounds. So students that failed the classes were much more likely to fail in situations where there were lectures. Traditional lectures were 1.5 more times likely to fail, and students in active learning classes outperformed those in traditionals by at least a half a standard deviation higher. So there's tons of evidence. There's lots of examples that active learning is important and active learning is clear. And we can keep going when you start looking at other domains. Improved student understanding, improved student attitudes, problem solving, perceptions and attitudes, increased content knowledge, development of graduate capabilities, increased employability, increased enthusiasm. It just keeps going on and on and on and on. So it goes to one of the questions of, well, why do we ignore it if that's the case? And part of it is that it can be difficult to do, and it's not always easy to do well. But also, we may not necessarily know. And a lot of us that have actually experienced teaching and learning, and say in a traditional university environment, we did just fine. So how come our students are doing just like we did? But one of the things that you have to look at, that most of your students are not like you. And that's an important realization, that many of your students are not going to grow up to be that revered professor at an elite university. It's the fraction of the fraction of the fraction of the percent. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind as we're looking at the evidence that's out there. One of my favorite final quotes, which really sums up everything that has to do with active learning, is the one who does the work does the learning. If you spend all of the time preparing that wonderful seminal lecture, you've done hours and hours of work for that perfect delivery, you did all the work and you did all the learning. At any stage in any class that you have, the best thing to do is to stop and think, well, I'm doing all the work here. How can I get the students to do the work? Instead of just sitting there, why don't you do the problem? Here's the problem, you do it. I'm not going to do it for you. You do it, and then we'll compare notes. How can we get the students to work? So, active learning doesn't just happen. It happens in a classroom where the teacher creates a learning environment that makes it more likely to occur. And this is one of those things that's important about more likely, is that you can only create the conditions for learning to succeed. You can't force learning to happen. Students have to walk through the door at the end of the day, and they have to be willing to engage. So one of my favorite iconic lecture slides is from the 1400s and shows that perfect example of a lecture where we have a couple of people, let's say in the back here, that are sleeping, some that forgot their computers for the day. They don't have any. They forgot all their materials. Others seem to be engaged in other kinds of activities rather than listening to the lecture. And this poor person seems to be looking at this person's notes as well. So not much has changed since the 1400s. But does this mean that lecturing is bad? Right? This is sort of what you may sort of get the perception when you look at active learning and talks about active learning, that lecturing is evil and we should just stop it. And it's like, that's not actually what it's all about. What it's all about is really a rebalancing. And what we are at the moment is out of balance. And we need to rebalance what we do things for lectures and what we do things for active learning. Or how can we combine the lecture and active learning in order to achieve a better balance? So the lecturing that's going on here, most people think of this as the traditional learning environment. But when you start looking, and I think the keynote yesterday showed some really good examples where if you look at the history of humanity, most of our learning that we've been doing has been active. I mean, if you go back to ages, let's say in the before 1000 or way back, everything was based around cognitive apprenticeships. You wanted to learn a skill, you wanted to learn something, you go and apprentice with somebody. You didn't sit in a room and have somebody tell you about being a blacksmith. You went and worked with a blacksmith and became a blacksmith, right? Lecturing is the little aberrant moment in history where we went from we need to scale up and tell people a lot of things because in this case, you may not be able to read this book well, so I'm going to read it to you. You may not be literate, so I'm going to be literate for you. But this idea that we have to transmit information by having a group of people sit in a room and another person tell them that is actually a little blip in our human history, and it's slowly going away. So in other words, what we really want to do is think about rebalancing the act so that we can say, let's use lecturing for what it's really good for, motivation, summarization, connecting key points, all of the stuff where your knowledge and your experience can wrap things up in a way that students can't necessarily do. And then we need to think about using active learning for being able to apply the ideas, getting things cemented into people's heads. In other words, increasing that experience around learning rather than just sitting there passively listening. So that's the first message about learning. We need to figure out how to rebalance and make sure that it's not just all lecturing and it's not just all active learning. And if you look at any good class that's doing active learning, you'll notice that it always moves between, maybe a little 10-minute lecture, let's work for 15 minutes, let's do another 10-minute lecture, work for 15 minutes. And the reason being is that we're attuning to people's attention spans, we're attuning the idea of brief momentary summation, introductions, lots of active work, and the same thing over and over again. So the next question is well, okay, so if we're talking about that, does space matter? And how does space interact with all of this? So this is another view of Montreal, and most of the McGill campus you can see here. But what we're talking about when we're talking about space is we're talking about the built environment. The built environment is basically any environment that we interact with. Almost all of our environments, even the forests that we interact with, are built. In other words, we've constructed things in one way or the other. We've worked with architects. We've built a whole structure for us to live in. And in the built campus environment, there's a number of different types of spaces. You might have what you call informal learning spaces. These are places where students might go to study, do group work, etc. And then, of course, the other type of spaces, which are more formal learning spaces. And most of what I'm going to end up talking about is dealing with the formal kind of learning spaces, less so with the informal sort of learning spaces. Mostly because the formal learning spaces require you to really interact with the space in order to get the optimize the most amount out of it, and allows you to take advantages of the affordances that exist within them. So one of the things that's interesting about space is that space impacts perception. And I think your perception group in the basement, in the receptions, and I would actually urge you to go back down and take a look, have a lot of really interesting illusions and really interesting examples of how perception can be twisted based on changes in your space. So this is an example of one where you can use optical illusions to create space on a floor or not create space on a floor, create an ocean or create a river where it doesn't exist and trick your brain into thinking that, change the notion of corners so that it looks like you can almost see through a building, even if you can't, even if it's only one building, as an example, or really mess with your brain by looking at an object that looks like does everybody see it moving? Yeah, well, it's not moving, obviously. But your brain thinks that it's moving. And this is interesting because we can trick our brains into a lot of different things besides that kind of impact. Here's another example that, are these straight lines or are they crooked lines? Parallel or not parallel? Sorry? Parallel, you're right, they are parallel. But again, it's another one of those wonderful optical illusions about how you can change your perceptions with space. Orange circles, the same size or different sizes? Different sizes or same sizes? So I hear mumbling one way or the other. Nobody's really sure. Nobody wants to commit publicly, maybe. We should have done this as a clicker question quietly so you could put in the numbers. But they're exactly the same size. You wouldn't necessarily know that either. Same idea of screwing around with your perception and messing around with your brain to a certain extent. And of course, our iconic example, does anybody remember this internet meme of what color is this dress? And it's particularly interesting today with the sun washing it out. It's even more, is this blue and black or white and gold? How many people see white and gold? How many people see blue and black? There, I think, has been a larger fight on the internet with this particular picture than anything else. It wreaked havoc, and when you read the stories about what happened with this picture, they had graphic artists and journalists fighting with each other about what color it was, and so they started to wash out the colors to give an example that, is it blue and black or is it white and gold? The dress is actually blue and black. But you see, and you may be seeing white and gold, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And it drives you crazy because it's like, but it's white and gold. I keep seeing white. It's not blue. I don't know, anyway. So those are important things to think about, and that connects with us with space, is it means that we can manipulate and change space to actually impact people's perceptions. We can change the depth of field. We can make spaces look bigger than they actually are. We can put pillars in the middle of our classrooms to obstruct things. I don't know if you have any pillars in your classrooms. We have lots of them as an example. And what's also interesting is that we can use things like light to change our actual behavior, and not only that, but change our performance. So there's some really interesting examples of, this is from a Neuroscience and Education article that talks about the benefits of blue light. Those of you that have kids know the no iPad after dinner idea, which is the idea of not having blue light. And it's the concept behind Kindles and why they actually look more like real paper than they look like screens. And the idea of blue light is the light coming from the sun, especially the height of the day, that is meant to energize you. And it actually messes around with your circadian rhythms. But we can actually artificially change this. So you can manipulate the blue light within particular spaces and actually have an impact on people's performance. Which is really interesting, because what if, for example, you get stuck with, let's say, a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock class? Could you like crank up the blue light, crank down the rest of the spectrum, and get people a little bit more energized and organized? You absolutely can. So the question is that as instructors, how much do we have in terms of control over our environments to be able to manipulate our environment to actually impact and match with the types of learning we want to do? The second thing I want to talk about space is that space impacts interaction. This is a great example from a great drawing that talks about a concept called proxemics. And what it really does is it talks about the types of interaction you can have at distances between students. So a good example is if you look at the 12 foot to the 25 foot. So if I stand behind this podium and I look out at you, many of you are beyond that 12-foot mark. When you're beyond that 12-foot mark, I have a very difficult time seeing your eyes. I'm not really sure where you're looking. I have a hard time seeing if, your body language, other than maybe arms crossed. I might be able to sort of figure, okay, if you have your arms crossed, you might have one kind of experience. It's very hard for me to see facial expressions, so confusion in the back row might be very difficult for me to gauge. So this idea that when you're in a public space, it's very performance-like. It's very much me giving you things and me telling you things, but it's very difficult for me to get feedback the other way. Whereas if I change the public space to a more social space, so the minute I come closer and I'm starting to get within that 4 foot to 12 foot mark, I can start to see facial expressions, I can connect to people more, I can see their eyes, I can see how they're interacting with me, I can see confusion, I can not see confusion, I can see laughter, and I might even be able to see a little bit of sweat. If you get close enough and you start getting people a little nervous, you might see some sweat coming down as an example. Then, of course, there's personal space. And personal space is one of those things in a classroom where you want to be able to connect really closely with the student, being able to sit down and talk with the student face to face. That social kind of interaction that you would see when you're sitting at a dinner table. So we're going from like a cocktail party to a dinner table concept. Intimate space, we hope we don't have any of that happening, but not at least publicly. But intimate space, you get pheromones and all sorts of other things that go along with that. What we really want to do when we look at our classroom spaces is much of our classroom spaces are fixed where the instructor-student interaction is in a public space kind of concept. Students are so far away that you're unable to connect to them on a personal level. In addition, you're often, let's say, behind a podium, so you can't even get out from the podium to be able to do something and interact with them. And they're probably hiding in the back just as much as anybody else. It's always, in any session you have, there's always more people at the back. So hello, friends in the back. There's always more people in the back than the front. But it's very hard because I can't connect with those people in the back, and it's hard for me to even get to them. I mean, I'll really mess with the poor cameraman if I go back there. But what we want to do is try and think of how can we take our public spaces and make them more into social spaces. This is the idea of why in active learning classrooms the podiums are moved to the middle of the room. Why are they in the middle of the room? They're in the middle of the room so that you can be close to students, and you can be connected with students, and you can be at any student table with a couple of steps. That's the whole idea. It's not about you. It may be less comfortable because you're in the middle, or you might have students to the back of you. It's about them. It's about being able to connect to them and turn those public spaces into social, and even have social spaces turn into personal spaces. The last is I want to talk about how space impacts behavior, and I've got a short little video I want to play about this. You may have seen this. Okay, my sound is gone, but that's okay. Take a look at what they're doing here with the stairs. So you can't hear the sound, but that's okay. The concept is still there. So what they did is made a piano on the left side of the staircase. And as you can see throughout the day, you see people interacting and playing with that piano, and less people taking the escalator. And it keeps going and going, with more and more people going up and down that staircase that has now been magically transformed into something interactive, almost like an interactive piece of art. So in this particular case, 66% more people took the stairs just by changing the environment slightly. So it's a great example of how the environment can impact behavior, a great amount of behavior. And architects know this. But as educators, we haven't really tapped into that kind of that ideas that come from architecture. And it's something that we can do. Because if we can do something like this with a staircase, think about what we can do when we apply that idea of space-changing behavior to classrooms, where we can alter and change our classrooms to help shape the kind of behaviors that we want. This is a great one from Volkswagen, actually. It's an ad for Volkswagen. Another famous one is, of course, Winston Churchill. You probably have known the quote, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." And what's particularly interesting about the house that they rebuilt after the war is he did two things in this that were really interesting. One is he built it smaller with less seats than number of people. And the second thing he did is he built it with a divide in the middle, so there was one side and the other. And if you changed your vote, you stood up, walked across the middle, a very slow, long walk to the other side to sit down. So those two things were very interesting, and I think Churchill really understood the concept around how you can shape a building and shape behavior. He built it with less seats than people, for one, for it to almost always feel full, and the second is if everybody was there and it was full, it was uncomfortable, and people had to make decisions to get out of there. So they wouldn't sit around and waste time, they would make decisions and move on. Very Churchill-like, I think. And of course, the middle divide, where if you crossed the line, if you crossed from one side to the other, you really had to cross. You had to stand up and walk all the way around with your colleagues watching you. So this idea that we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us has been built into the way that we interact with our classrooms and interact with our spaces. When you look at a space like this, what message does this send to you about teaching and learning when you see that space? What does it tell you? As a student, what message is it communicating? Passive, what else? That's right, the expert is behind the Volkswagen at the front. Sorry? Regimented. Less important, students are passive, students have to sit there quietly and the instructors have to talk. So ultimately, we have to think that space creates expectations of behavior, suggests how to act, and communicates what's valued. When you walk into a lecture theater, there is a role that everyone's supposed to play, and everyone plays the role. Instructors go to the front, where they orate. Students sit in the back and write down notes and sit there quietly. So what can we do to rethink that and change the way we interact with our space? This is a great example from one of our largest classrooms. And you notice this poor student here has his legs over the edge of the tier. His knees are up against the front. He can't move because he's in one of those wonderful little theater seats. And he isn't even using the tablet because the computer that he has doesn't fit on the tablet. So this is one of those, this is, what are we doing? And this is, Grumpy Cat does not like this kind of classroom. This is not the type of spaces we want to build or support. Both of those examples I showed were from McGill. So what can we do? So I'm going to suggest that there are 4 things that we can do, and we're going to end our keynote through these 4. The first is we need to create good governance. We need a way of ensuring that our spaces are created with input from everybody, especially the faculty that are using them. The second is we need to design our spaces thinking about pedagogy first, and all of the stuff and all the aesthetics second. Third, we need to create spaces for active learning anywhere. And the last is we need to design faculty development programs to help faculty at all stages and help faculty where they are. So in terms of the first I want to talk about in terms of creating governments, I'm going to tell you about 2 groups that we started at McGill. So 10 years ago, 2006 or so, we created a Teaching and Learning Spaces working group. And the mandate behind this group was to come up with a vision for teaching and learning spaces. Our provost at the time took all the money that was being given to all the faculties, took all of it together, put it in one big pool, and then said, okay, we're going to make a committee, and we're going to deal with the money as a group. and then turned to the teaching and learning unit, our learning unit, and said, and guess what? You're in charge of it. Now, this was at a moment, and this was an interesting moment, where our director emeritus, who founded our center, who's since retired, this was an opportunity. Okay, what does a teaching and learning unit have to do with the prioritization of physical spaces on campus, specifically classrooms? But we thought of it as a way or an opportunity to think about learning. And it's a new access point to discuss teaching and learning, especially when you think about that we were tasked to help create standards based on sound pedagogical principles and steward the funding. And as most people know, those that steward the funding have a certain amount of control as to how that funding is used. So there was a little bit of deviousness on our part about getting involved, because we could say, well, instead of building lousy classrooms, maybe we can build better ones. We don't know what those are, but I'm sure there's something better. So this particular committee has about 40, 45 members on it. We have representatives on this committee from every single faculty or every single school on campus. We have our enrollment registrar people. We have our estate planning people. We have our IT people. Our AV people are there. We have academics. We have people from operations. And what's really interesting is that this was one of the first times 10 years ago that the operating side of the house and the academic side of the house sat down in the same room and talked about the issue of how do we improve our spaces for student learning and how do we make our classrooms better? And that was revolutionary, for us especially at that time. Because many times, our planning groups would go off, build a classroom, and then tell the faculty after it's done. You say, well, what do you mean done? Well, we put it in here. You say, well, why'd you put the podium over there? Well, that's where it's going to go. Why did you put this here? Well, that's the standards say that. So we tried to get backwards and avoid that and say, well, what if we started from scratch? So what we did with this committee is that all of the faculty would put forward their priorities. We'd sit there together, try and sort them out and figure out what we're going to do with them, and then steward that funding and approve it and move it forward to renovation of our classrooms. So we'd have a certain number of classrooms we'd be renovating each year and moving forward. There were a couple of great things we did with this committee. This committee never met in a boardroom. We met in classrooms, and we moved all around the university. And the amazing part is there are so many people, so many faculty and so many people on our operations sides that had never actually been in the classrooms, never even sat in them. And what's even more interesting is we had one meeting where we had a meeting in a lecture hall. And it was great because we had this meeting where most people were facing front. And at one point somebody said, it's really, really hard to talk to each other in this room. And we said, yes, it is. We had people in our registrars going into some of our larger lecture halls or other classrooms go, wow, these are really small seats. This is really uncomfortable. It's like, yeah, it's really uncomfortable. Do you know what it's like to be in a class like this for an hour and a half with a student? So there was a lot of really important things around that kind of experience and the site visits. The other thing that we did with our priorities with our site visits is that we had faculties seeing what other faculties were experiencing. So for example, the faculty of management, let's say in the faculty of arts, the faculty of management would put their priorities forward and the faculty of arts would put their priorities forward, and we go start to visit the rooms, we would actually have faculties pull their priorities back because they would say, wow, we thought our rooms were bad, yours are really bad. And that was a really interesting experience because before the centralization of funding, basically each faculty did whatever it needed to do with the money. And the problem with that is it got reprioritized in different places and in different ways. So this whole sort of stewardship, and one of the benefits of doing that is it allowed us to really, as a university, move from the me to the we, so that the entire community that we build together can make decisions and move forward of what's best for McGill in its grand thinking, rather than what's best for one faculty, what's best for another. Because any spaces that were renovated as a part of our centralized committee became centrally scheduled and centrally supported, so that anybody could use those classrooms. So it was another sort of devious way of the provost of getting the rooms away from the control of a local department and really in the control of the university, so everybody could share the resources. Because, to be honest, it wasn't their room in the first place. It wasn't even their building. They just happened to be in that building at the university. It was a university building. The second thing that we did, I want to mention, is thinking about pedagogy first. So one of the things that we thought about is that if we're going to think about how to redesign our spaces, how can we talk in a language that is going to communicate to our academia and is going to communicate to students, is going to communicate to the rest of the public, that isn't going to be, we just want a nice chair. So we started looking at architectural, educational, and psychology research. We started looking at the NSSE benchmarks. And those of you that know the NSSE, it's basically the National Survey on Student Engagement. It used in 1,400 schools in North America. And it really looks at benchmarks for what makes college successful for students. We took all of these and we created our principles for the design of teaching spaces and then ended up creating design features for those learning spaces. So the way this ended up looking, and I'm just going to give you an example here, is we took things like academic challenge, learning with peers, experiences with faculty in campus environment, and in high-impact practices, and did things like, well, if we want to increase academic challenge, we need students to be able to engage with content in classrooms. We can't give them a little tablet that's this big and then expect them to work. We don't work in little desk spaces this big. Why would we expect students to be able to work in them? Learning with peers, we need a way that students can actually interact together. If everybody's facing in one direction and the chairs can't move, how are we going to communicate and collaborate with each other? If we're going to increase engagement with faculty, but there's no way to get down the row, how are we going to interact with our students? So all of these things that we came with principles started manifesting themselves, and the details aren't important, but the manifestation would be, for example, if we want to promote active engagement with content, we need work surfaces that are adequate for laptops and notebooks in the same space. Not one or the other, but both. You have to be able to lay out your work if you're going to work in a classroom. Comfortable furniture. We need acoustics designed for not just one-way interaction, but multi-way interaction. We need our lighting connected in with our AV systems. We need a standardized setup so that faculty don't have to relearn every single room they go to. They go, connect, and move. So those are some of our examples of how our principles manifested themselves. The other pieces I want to mention here are examples of how we created our third area, created spaces for active learning anywhere. So there are a bunch of different examples that I want to walk you through, from collaborative lecture halls to prototype spaces. So let's take a look at a couple of these as examples. So what we started to do at the beginning with our active learning initiatives is how can we redesign our lecture halls to make them more collaborative? And in some cases, we could do very little, but we did something. So here's an example of a lecture hall that we rebuilt. It was all in cement tiers, so we couldn't do much with it. But what we did is say, okay, let's focus on increasing the spaces for student work. So instead of those small little tablets, we went to this pull-out, almost airline seating example. You notice that there's no arms on any of the chairs. So what we were able to do is get this kind of convertible bench seating, and we gave students 150% more space to actually work inside a lecture hall. Now, it's not a perfect space, but it's better than it was before. And it's at least one step towards supporting some types of active and collaborative learning. Other examples is from Iowa State with 363 seats. Iowa State did something similar where they took a lecture hall and said, you know what we really could do is we could actually have a set of fixed seats and then a set of movable seats and have the seats rotate. So you could have two rows where the front row rotates and turns back, so you could actually have students interacting with each other. Here's another example from Denver, where the students go from a lecture mode to spinning around and actually talking to each other in a collaborative mode. Other examples, there's a Denver one again, that sort of front row that pivots as an example. Old style seating, not perfect, not our most wonderful spaces, but taking one small change of being able to convert from a lecture to a collaborative method very quickly. The University of Exeter here in the UK is an alumni auditorium, and if you've ever seen it, it also has those rotating spinning seats that allow you to do two rows on a tier. We also have examples of just two rows on a tier. So this is another room for McGill with about 100 seats where we've got two rows on a tier so that the front row can spin around and work on a table with another, with writable walls on the side as an example for people to work in. This is a really interesting and bizarre way to have an interactive lecture hall at the Oregon State University. Their Learning Innovation Center is a 600-seat lecture hall completely in the round. And the idea behind this is they picked up on the concept of not necessarily students collaborating with each other, but allowing the instructor to interact with students. And in this particular room, in the top and the middle here that you see, the instructor can be anywhere in the room very, very quickly. They're no more than 25 or 30 feet from even the last row, even with a 600-seat lecture hall. The projection is in sort of omnidirectional in the round as an example. But each one of these examples are picking up on things in our principles of how to interact with students positively and connect with them in a way that gets it from public to social to personal space, or for example, giving students the opportunity to turn and rotate and work with each other. Here's an example. Hine Hall in Indiana, they actually have a table in between each tier. So they have a front row, and then right behind the front row is a table that students are working at. So everybody can spin around and work at the table behind them. Even better than a row behind, you've got tables behind, and every other row has a table on it. Greenlaw at the University of North Carolina, this is an interesting room. It almost looks like 6 small rooms inside a bigger one. So each one of these tiers is a whole bunch of movable furniture on it where students can move and collaborate and work, and has flat screens, etc. There's a path down the middle that the instructor can move in, and it allows you to have a very large number of students, 100 students, set up in these small groups, all within the same space. Again, that interactive lecture hall idea. Another example of that, University of Windsor took that a little bit farther and said, okay, well, what if we did a lecture hall with tables on a tier instead of just rows on a tier? So here's an example here at Windsor where they took 350 students and had them sitting at tables in a collaborative mode where students can work with each other at the tables but then still be part of a very large lecture hall. We did a riff on this by saying, okay, what if we did something like that, but maybe we made it a little bit more interactive? So this is an example that we built in 2015 where you'll see there's 96 students actually on 4 rows, and each one of these tiers, 4 tiers I should say, and each one of these tiers has 6 student tables in the round. And what's really interesting about this example is that you can see that the students actually behind each one have whiteboards. So the whiteboards that you see right behind the table allow the students to interact and collaborate within that lecture hall. They still have great sight lines in the front, and if you look at the front here, it actually has video conferencing, and you can actually connect to another classroom. Whiteboards all around the front, whiteboards on the sides, movable whiteboards within the space. And what you get are an example where students can collaborate behind them and actually use the whiteboards to draw and work, but then spin around and actually have a plenary that you might do inside our collaborative lecture hall. Active learning classrooms are another example of being able to push that boundary and say, well, what if we actually built a room from scratch to support collaboration? What would that look like? Here's one of our first examples we built in 2009, and this is a 72-seat classroom with an instructor at the middle, tables of 9. Each one of these tables were color-coded, so each color-coded table had a color piece of glass that they could work with. So students already had spaces on the wall they could work. There were some computers there that they could do some work on as well. There are multiple screens around the room, and the entire room is wrapped in whiteboards. So the room is designed for collaboration, designed for students to work with each other at their teams. Now, you can do lectures in the room, but if you try to lecture for an hour, it feels odd because the room is designed for collaboration. Just like if you're in a lecture hall and you're doing collaboration the entire time, it feels off. It's not necessarily what the room was designed for. So looking at these hybrid examples gives some experience of what we can do. Here's another example of a more computerized workstations where we have banana boat shaped tables, and they're shaped in curves so that students can look at each other's work very easily. The tables actually have a built-in hole, so the monitors are low. And it actually allows you to see over the top, so you can actually interact with your team, but still work on a high-end machine. They do a lot of environmental modeling in this particular room. And you notice wrapped around the sides, what do we have? Whiteboards everywhere, whiteboards and projectors. And that's, again, you keep seeing these themes coming up. Here's another small example, 6-person tables, movable podium, writable walls around the room, short-throw projectors where students can work. Here's an example from Indiana. They actually have a flat screen, giant flat screen stitched to the front, and each one of those flat screens can pull the screens from the tables. So you can have 16 different screens up on that large screen as well, or you can push it back out to the teams. So again, it's that idea of a learning studio or collaborative space where students can work on either analog or digital work together and be able to then share that with the larger group. Brudix Hall in Minnesota, these were some of the original folks that we talked to back in 2009 as well. They built a 126-seat active learning classroom in groups of 3, tables of 9. University of North Dakota, there's 180 seats in this active learning classroom. I've taught in this room, and it's really big. But it's interesting because it looks at the idea that you can scale up active learning classrooms. You can scale up beyond 50, beyond 60, beyond 70. And there are many examples of 180. And actually, in Australia, they have some really good examples. The University of Queensland, they have 2 300-seat active learning classrooms that actually combine to a 600. They're doing it almost basically in a gym. And what's interesting is the TAs were wearing these construction flag kind of fluorescent colors, and the TAs would move around the room with the instructors. And what's really interesting about that room is the students thought there were more teachers and TAs than there actually were, because they're focused in working on their teams. Our CyberMed facility for our medicine faculty, we have 3 80-seat active learning classrooms and 7 16-seat small group classrooms. This is really interesting because you get a curved wall. But again, the same theme is coming up. Small tables, projectors on the wall. In this case, all the projectors are hidden up around the outside. You can't necessarily see them. We started to reduce a lot of our technology so you don't see it as much. And of course, writable walls all around the room, movable tables. And we have a lot of medicine, folks in the Faculty of Medicine that are using these rooms, especially our applied areas like physical occupational therapy, nursing, et cetera. This is our latest one that we're building, which is a 2-story active learning classroom, writable walls all around the bottom, and then projections all around the second stage that's there. This is going to be our largest with 88 seats. We'd love to get bigger. We just don't have a footprint of size to do that. But again, we took 2 old classrooms, collapsed them into one, and when it was collapsed into one, we had a long rectangle, and that's not a great lecture room, but it is a good active learning classroom because everybody's working on their own teams and spread out in different areas. The third I want to talk about is active and collaborative teaching labs. And what's important here is that the idea that many of our teaching labs that we work in, or discipline-specific spaces, wet labs, dry labs, they're collaborative by default. Nobody would ever tell a chemistry faculty, or a chemistry faculty would never say, I really want a place to lecture in my research lab or in my teaching lab. Nobody would ever say that because it's a place to apply your learning. So we've taken a lot of our ideas from our active learning classrooms and applied them to teaching labs. This is an example of a dry teaching lab facility that we have, that we use for physics at our rural campus. Here we have Y-shaped tables with groups of the students on each end. They're in groups of 4, 3 groups of 4. We have writable walls, and there's actually glass graph paper that you can see in the corner, along with places for students to project. And as well, a whole bunch of different areas around, and I'll just sort of rotate it here. We have some free pillars. If you want to take a pillar, we have lots of them. But we took a really terrible space in the basement and made it into a wonderful place to teach. Everything is at counter height. They do experiments off the edge of the table as an example. Here's another interactive physics lab that we have. You'll notice there's steel beams that they do experiments on. This has movable furniture, writable walls. Students are interacting at counter height, gas and vacuum at the middle as well. Our geology lab that actually has tables made of wood because everything scratches the table, so we needed something we could buff out and revarnish. And this actually is a geology lab that's a geology lab and a classroom. So all of the rocks go away, and there's all the storage for rocks to go and microscopes, and it can actually be used as a classroom when it's not being used as a rock lab. This is not our new chemistry lab. This is our old undergraduate chemistry lab. But what's really interesting is we took a lab that looked like that, which really was a horror show, I mean, beyond a horror show, and turned it into something that really took advantage of our ideas around an active learning classroom. So this is the lab as it stands now, where we have pods of students. So each pod that you see are in the round. Students are facing each other. They're standing doing their experiments. We have gas and services coming in the middle, fume hoods wrapped around the sides, and each group of 3 pods is set up with 1 TA. So instead of a TA running up and down long aisles or anything horrible like that in a design, we have an open, circulation appropriate kind of interactive space so that students can interact with TAs and see demonstrations without having to all try and cram at the end of an aisle where nobody can see. Here's another example. It's a 2-floor facility that we have for undergraduate labs, and all of our undergraduate students in chemistry will rotate through these spaces. The fourth type I want to mention is something called a prototype space. So this is an important element because I think that one of the things that we wanted to do and wanted to support at McGill was the opportunity for people to experiment. And one of the things that we're not able to do very often when we design our spaces is try something, usually because it's expensive. So we're going to try this furniture, but that's just going to stay there because we don't have enough money to retry something else or switch out to something else. So we decided to work out a deal with one of our furniture manufacturers and say, all right, we want a space with every single different type of thing you have. It's going to look weird. It's going to have a lot of stuff in it, and we want to have a playground. And what's really interesting about this playground is this is actually where we do all our faculty development. If we don't do it here, we do it in active learning classrooms. But we do our faculty development in this kind of space because it allows us as faculty developers to play with this, to try different configurations. We now find furniture that this is really great for students, but not so great for faculty. So faculty development, we don't want these kind of chairs, but the students don't mind them. So we've come up with things like that. We're able to experiment with technologies like, well, what happens if we bring in somebody remote into the space? How can we make them feel like they're part of a group? What kind of digital writing technologies can we play with? What types of whiteboards? You notice in here we have personal-sized whiteboards, we have larger whiteboards, we have whiteboards on the wall, lots of experimentation. And that's another area that we want to, or I think would be useful for almost any university, to have that kind of prototype space where you can constantly change and manipulate it and experiment with new types of pedagogies that you want to implement and try out new types of active learning. The last I want to touch on is really this idea of the classroom of the future. And it's funny because I'm not going to talk about the classroom of the future as being a VR-enabled room. What I'm going to talk about the classroom of the future is the basic classroom. The idea that what do we want in a standard classroom? This was our standard classroom in 2012. The idea that it should have movable furniture, It should have every wall be writable and basic audiovisual stuff. That's it. And what's really great is this kind of room allows for a huge range of pedagogies to happen. Everything from a lecture to applied applications for students to work in teams, the writable walls around the room always giving us feedback as one of the most important parts of the classrooms. And as we move forward, we've actually updated this. So this is one of our examples this year of one of the classrooms we did in our Faculty of Law that on the one hand can be a road classroom with writable walls around the side. In this case, we have more than one AV. We have multiple AV sources and things like that, but then magically can easily transform into a collaborative team space. And this is the kind of space we want as our base level average across every single space at the university. So we might have extremes where we have our lecture halls on one end, we might have our active learning classrooms on another. Both of those still support collaboration, but in different ways, and both of them still support lecturing in different ways. But most of our middle is going to end up these flat rooms that have to be movable and flexible. And we have to take great care in doing that because it isn't easy to have rooms with movable furniture and have people be able to use them well. So the big question I want to touch on at the end here is, well, are these rooms worth it? And this is one of those eternal questions that we keep wrestling with, especially provosts love to wrestle with. And I wanted to point to two studies. One of them by a friend of mine, Christopher Brooks, has done a great study on active learning spaces and really looked at holding all factors except learning spaces constant. Students are consistently better in these kind of spaces than traditional classroom settings. And this is an interesting thing to look at, that space can actually have an impact. Now, one of the difficulties is that you have to think is it's not just the space with the person in it. We'll come to that in a second. Another example that they did is they actually reduced classroom time by flipping the class and having it be more interactive. They were able to have just as good outcomes, if not better, by reducing the actual classroom time. So instead of 3 hours a week, it was 2 hours a week, and they were doing stuff online, flipping, blending, and actually doing stuff in the classroom that was interactive. We've done a whole bunch of our own studies in terms of focus groups and interactive videos that we've created, looked at usage data. Our experiences in their active learning classrooms are generally off the charts. We're very, very careful to make sure that we only get people in those rooms that want to be in those rooms. And that's an important part as well. We need to make sure that faculty are being matched with the types of rooms they need to support their pedagogy. And you don't want to be in a room that's a lecture hall if you're going to do a lot of collaboration. And if really all you're going to do is a lecture, we don't need you in the collaborative active learning classroom. Other evidence of impact of these kind of spaces, students and instructors almost always rate these spaces as very positive, unless you have an instructor who's in it who doesn't want to be there. But we'll talk about that too. The outcomes are generally higher, decreased failure rates, especially in students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And instructors are often doing more interaction and less lecture in any of these spaces. But it's important to think of our potential impact versus the actual impact. And when you look at spaces like our active learning classrooms, you need to look at how can we measure the potential impact. And actually, that's what the learning space rating system is designed for. And we have a learning space rating system that was set up with EDUCAUSE that I've been part of. And what's really interesting about this scoring system is it's like the LEAD approach for environment, but instead for active learning. And you can actually score your campus and score individual rooms to say, how good is the potential for this room to be able to support active learning? But the interesting thing about that, that's just the potential. The actual use of that particular space really directly relies upon the faculty member that's using it. And in order really to look at impact, you have to start looking at things like post-occupancy surveys, interviews, focus groups, direct observations. We've done a lot of these over the years as well. And it's really important to be able to not only look at the potential that our spaces have for active learning, but our actual uses of those spaces. Which leads to my final thoughts, would have to do with faculty development. And I bring up this wonderful formula car as an example, because this is a high precision machine. The potential for this thing to go fast is unparalleled. But I can tell you there's a very big difference between me driving this car and Michael Schumacher driving this car. Michael Schumacher is able to eke out the performance of a machine like this that I just don't have the skills to do. And that's what's really important to think about, is that we can build wonderful, fabulous spaces. But if we don't help people across the university able to use those spaces, what we got is everybody's basically given a Formula One car, and half the time we grind the gears and destroy it on the way forward. So we really need to think about how we can support our faculty from everything from the conceptual, sort of how do we support you on the values and beliefs of your teaching, to the strategic, how do we help you design the types of instruction that you need to do? How can we help you in the tactical? What can you do Tuesday in this room? How can you change your strategy so that you can actually have an impact? And of course, how do you implement it? When you actually go into the room and do this, what kind of support do you need when you're in the room? And we built a whole comprehensive support structure looking at, well, what do people need before teaching, after teaching, during teaching? And what can we do to anticipate their needs? Everything from group meetings and room orientations to consultations to support to job aids that we give students and faculty, and of course our in-room tech support. When we first started our active learning classrooms, we had students hanging around in the back of the room for the first few weeks of term. Basically the idea of an ambulance hanging around a bar, right? Waiting for something to happen. The students would swoop in, save the problem, and move on. We still had our phone support, but nobody was going to pick up the phone and try and troubleshoot what to do in an active learning classroom at the beginning. And as a result of all of this, a lot of people using our active learning classrooms found that we ended up actually having much less tickets and support problems in our active learning classrooms than anywhere else. And it wasn't an expensive or complicated thing to do. But the idea is that we're starting where faculty are, trying to give faculty as many options as possible, trying to ensure that we can meet with them one-on-one, that we can be able to support them without having that one time where you can learn about the room and then the rest of the year you're on your own. So ultimately, we need to think about our classrooms is that our learning spaces can make a difference when you have structures that can take advantage of them. And that's what's most important and why I really want to end on that faculty development note. Because it's really critical that any university, and all universities, and I know yours does and ours do and many others do, try to focus on helping people take advantage of the learning spaces that we have. And ultimately, by changing our spaces, we get into a situation where we look at the built environment. And it's a great quote to think about, that the built environment or the built campus environment is a physical manifestation of the learning and teaching vision that we have for our institution. When you walk on campus as a student, our space on campus communicates our values and communicates what we think is important. When you walk into a dingy, horrible lecture hall, the idea is that learning isn't important, and it's really not an important thing for you to do. We need to change that attitude, we need to change that experience so that when students come to campus, we communicate the vision that we want in terms of supportive teaching and learning. So with that, I want to think that we need to focus on high quality faculty development and high quality learning spaces, and I want to end it there for questions.
Thank you, Adam. We have some roving mics and we have some time for questions. And can I just ask that you wait until the microphone reaches you, because this is being filmed and it's very difficult to hear the questions that people are asking if they don't use the microphone. So I know we have one over here, Natalie, if you can.
And I will be here the rest of the day. If you don't want to ask it in a big group, you can target me afterwards.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to ask you, what, if anything, do you think is the role of more isolated or personalized immersive learning environments like an individual virtual reality headset or even active engagement with text, teaching the students how to actively learn from their texts? Mm-hmm. And the reason I ask that is because almost all of the examples you seem to be showing of active learning are social learning, and that concerns me for a couple of reasons. So firstly, I agree with you that learning styles don't really exist, but so I just read a book by Susan Cain about introversion. Mm-hmm. Apparently, for introverts, learning actually goes down in more social, more open plan spaces. Also, some people, quite a few people apparently, according to my ENT audiologist, have difficulty learning hearing against background noise. But also for those who are not neurotypical, like slightly on the autistic spectrum, a lot of noise, a lot of social interaction can contribute to sensory overload and reduce cognitive processing. So, I mean, say, how much space in the timetable do you have for individual private study versus these learning spaces, for instance? Or are there specific active learning techniques that you can use on your own or in small groups?
That's a really good question. I think it's really important that active learning does not necessarily mean you're talking to somebody else. Absolutely. And that's why the definition from Barclay talks about the mind being actively engaged. So you can be absolutely doing active learning alone with material. There's no question about that. As long as you're not passively reading, you're reading and taking notes, or active listening techniques, all of those things can be done in a solitary way. I think also the reason why I talked about the built environment and our informal versus formal. Informal spaces is generally on campus where most of that kind of individual work happens. So the idea is that if we're getting everyone together, it tends to be a less effective thing to do if we're going to just work alone. If we're going to just work alone, then we don't all need to be in the same room. Now, if you do want to have people work alone and then connect together, okay, we want to be in that same room. So I think there's a real necessity to have a combination of the types of informal spaces that support that collaboration with others outside the classroom and allow students to work alone, including in spaces that are quiet. And actually, the term that our library uses is ninja level quiet. Which is an interesting way of thinking about it, that kind of spaces those kind of spaces are in huge demand at all of our universities, and we do need those spaces. I think that those spaces are often thought of as in our library spaces or in our informal spaces, and less so do we think of a classroom as a ninja quiet kind of space. So I think that's a distinction I would make, is that a lot of that kind of solitary individual learning is going to be happening on your own outside of the traditional sort of classroom, as we call it. But there also are really good examples, and Penn State has some really interesting examples of groups of students doing VR together. So they're doing VR in their own kind of VR setup, but they're in the same room and they're all together in that same space, so they can sort of decouple from the VR and then talk about their experience and then go back in again. So I think if you're looking at some sort of space where you're able to do that in and out, move from solitary to group, then I think that's really critical. And it isn't to say that you can't have quiet time in your classrooms. I mean, just because we have active learning classrooms at people at a table does not mean there's a moment of stop, quiet, reflect on this idea, write down some ideas, and then we're going to do something afterwards. I think your discussion around neurotypical students is a really good one, and I think there has been some discussion about what to do with those kind of situations in terms of designs of classrooms. And there are really good examples of designs of classrooms for those with different abilities. And I think that in that case, what you're looking at are things where a lot of students actually have silencing headphones and things like that as well. What we've also found, though, is that it also helps work in a different way. So we've had some great comments of students that have said, you know, I have ADHD, and actually these kind of active spaces are much better for me than actually as the traditional sort of lecture hall, because I can actually engage in lots of different ways instead of just sort of trying to sit there quietly and do one particular activity for a long time. But I do think it's really important, and we do not want to lose the idea that solitary or individual activity does not mean you're learning or does not mean you're doing active learning, which you absolutely can.
Okay. Can we have there's one quick question from Linnea at the back, and then I think we'll have to stop because we're in coffee time already, but there are other sessions, so we don't want to run too late. So Linnea, one quick question.
Okay, the question is currently our lectures are generally 50 minutes long. Do you think with the active learning spaces, do you need to actually, say you have 20 lectures, you compress them into shorter, or less lectures but longer periods? Do you need more time to get people set up and engaged?
Yeah, that's a really good argument for having things like active learning classrooms already set up to go. One of our biggest discussions with faculty that we're doing things in an active way, their question, well, why would I want to go to an active learning classroom? I said, yeah, because the cognitive load is zero. You walk in, it's set up to do your collaboration, you're ready to go. You don't have to move the furniture around and set it up every single time you get there, et cetera. But you do bring a good point about what to do about that short period of time. It tends to be the case in a lot of these active environments that you go deeper and spend longer. So students might be, it's often very difficult to get students away from the activity that they're doing. And what faculty sometimes will find is that I'm covering less material when I'm doing things in depth in a very active way. But then again, what does covering material mean? And if you were doing it in a lecture hall where covering material means I got past slide 4, that's not really covering material. You have said the material, but did the students do anything with it? Maybe not. So I do think what happens oftentimes when you're looking at these kind of collaborative spaces is it does tend to give you the opportunity to rethink what's really important. You know, and in that hour, I may only have 3 really important things we're going to talk about or think about, and these are the 3 most important, and we're going to chunk them into, let's say, 15-minute pieces. But there's often one of our biggest difficulties in our teaching is we try to do too much, and we do too much at a surface level, and we don't do enough at depth. And a lot of the times that we can remedy that by looking at some of these active learning spaces and think that I'm going to reduce the content, but I'm actually going to learn it better.
So thank you very much for what you've enjoyed this morning, and enjoy the rest of your day. And one last thank you to Adam, if you don't mind.
Thank you. My pleasure.